My wife came home without the wedding ring after a girls' trip, and she walked through the door still talking about the lake house, about Simone's new boat, about how exhausted she was, and I watched her set her weekend bag down, and I saw her left hand, and I stopped hearing words. There was a tan line where the ring had been, not a fresh one, a tan line that had been building for days. She didn't mention it. She moved to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and kept talking, and I stood there thinking, she's not going to bring it up. She's going to wait and see if I do. I didn't. Not that night. The next morning, while she was still asleep, I called an attorney. Her name was Claire, and we'd been married 4 years. By the time she walked through that door, I had already noticed enough things that I should have stopped rationalizing months earlier. The changed phone passcode, the location sharing that wasn't working for the last 2 days of the trip. A hotel charge Derek had shown me 11 weeks before she left, in a city that wasn't on any itinerary she'd mentioned, that I had talked myself into believing was a work conference I'd simply forgotten about. I had a folder's worth of reasons to ask direct questions. I kept choosing not to because I was someone who believed that patience was the same thing as trying. It wasn't. I understand that now. At the time, I thought I was being a reasonable person in a difficult season. What I was actually doing was giving her time to get her story straight. She was 33, marketing coordinator, increasingly absorbed in a friend group that treated commitment like a personality flaw. Simone was the center of that group, 36, twice divorced, extremely confident in her opinions about what other women deserve from their lives. I'd met Simone 4 times, and each time she'd looked at me the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they're planning to donate. I didn't hate Simone. I just noticed that every time Claire spent a long weekend with her, Claire came home with slightly revised opinions about whether I was too serious, too present, too focused on having a plan for everything. Sunday night, we ate dinner. I had made pasta because I'd been home since morning and needed something to do with my hands. Claire talked about the lake house, the kayaks, the fire pit, Simone's new boat. She did not mention the ring. I did not mention the ring. I remember straightening the salt shaker twice during that meal for no reason. After dinner, I asked her, "Where's your ring?" She paused, not dramatically. Just a half-second delay that told me she'd been waiting for the question and had already decided on her answer. I took it off to put sunscreen on and forgot to put it back. "It's in my bag." She didn't move toward the bag. I said, "Okay," and I cleared the plates. The next morning, the ring was back on her finger. She'd put it on before she came to the kitchen, which meant she'd remembered it was missing before she saw me. I noticed that. I didn't say anything. She poured coffee and asked if I had a work call in the afternoon, and I said yes. And she nodded, and that was the entire conversation. I work in project management for a mid-sized construction firm. I'm the kind of person who keeps receipts organized by month and writes things down before he forgets them. Derek, my closest friend, works in finance and has opinions about joint accounts that I used to find exhausting. About 8 months into the marriage, he'd started occasionally sending me screenshots of spending summaries because he thought I should pay more attention to our finances than I did. I appreciated it and mostly ignored it. He was the one who had flagged the hotel charge. He'd texted me a screenshot in early March. "This ring a bell?" A charge from a Marriott brand in a city about 4 hours from us. 2 nights. The dates were a weekend in February when Claire had told me she was at a work conference, one of those regional marketing summits she attended every few months. I'd been on a job site that weekend. I stared at the screenshot for a while and then texted back, "Yeah, conference. Already knew." I hadn't already known. I just didn't want it to be what it might be. That Monday after the girls' trip, while Claire was at work, I sat in my car in the parking garage near my office and I called Rebecca Marsh, a family law attorney whose name I had looked up at 2 in the morning about 6 weeks earlier, and then closed the browser tab on, twice. I booked a consultation for Tuesday. I sat in the car for another 20 minutes afterward, which I don't have a good explanation for. Then I went upstairs and ran a project status meeting and answered 17 emails. Rebecca's office had bad lighting and a dying plant in the corner that bothered me more than it should have. She walked me through the process without any drama. I took notes on my phone. She asked whether there were children. No. Whether we owned property together. No, the apartment lease was in my name. Whether there were shared accounts. Yes, 1 joint checking account. And whether I had reason to believe there had been marital misconduct. I said I had some documentation. She said, "Bring it to the consultation." Before the consultation, I made one other call. I asked Derek to walk me through what I needed to do to redirect my direct deposit to a personal account without touching the joint account. He said it was straightforward. It wasn't bad faith, as long as I didn't drain the shared account, and he'd help me set it up. He also said, "You should have called me 6 weeks ago." I said I knew. The consultation went 45 minutes. Rebecca reviewed the hotel charge screenshot, the notes I'd made about the location sharing, and the timeline I'd written out. She was measured and practical, and she told me what to expect. I drove home and made dinner. Claire came home around 6:30 and said she was thinking about repainting the living room. I asked what color. She said she was considering a green-gray. I said that sounded nice. That night I could hear her on the phone in the bedroom. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the voice. Controlled, reassuring, the voice she used when she was managing a situation. My guess was she was talking to her mother, Patrice, who lived 40 minutes away and who I had always gotten along with reasonably well. Patrice was the kind of person who noticed things and didn't always say so. I stood in the hallway for a moment and then went back to the living room. I stopped performing ease. Not dramatically. I didn't pick fights or go cold in a way she could point at. I just stopped generating warmth she hadn't done anything to earn. I stopped suggesting plans. I stopped asking about her week with the kind of enthusiasm that required her to match it. When she asked if I was doing okay, I said I was tired. It was technically true. What I noticed was that this bothered her less than I expected. She accepted my tiredness and filled the space with her own routine, which told me something I didn't want to know. She hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice that my behavior had changed. 3 days after the consultation, a confirmation document from Rebecca's office arrived in my email with a file number. I read it sitting at the kitchen table. Claire's keyring was on the counter next to mine, both of them on the ceramic dish by the door, the one she'd bought at a craft market 2 years ago. Small, blue-gray, just big enough for keys. I read the email twice. Then I got up and started making dinner, because we were still, for the time being, sharing the same apartment. I set a plate at her side of the table from pure habit, then stood there looking at it, and then sat down and left it where it was. The first person I told was my sister Joelle. She's 37, lives 20 minutes from our apartment, and has an uncanny ability to respond to bad news by immediately identifying the most practical next step. I drove to her place on a Thursday evening and told her everything. The ring, the hotel charge, the attorney, the file number. She listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her. When I finished, she said, "Do you need somewhere to stay when the papers are filed?" I said not yet. She handed me a coffee and said, "Okay," and that was the end of her emotional response. I found this enormously comforting. A week after the consultation, Derek called me on my lunch break. He'd been thinking about the hotel charge and had gone back through some of the joint account summaries he still had saved. What he found wasn't dramatic, no single enormous transaction. But when he laid it out, it was hard to ignore. Over 8 months, there was roughly $4,200 in discretionary charges that didn't match any household expense I could account for. Restaurant charges on evenings I'd been out of town. Smaller hotel charges. Not the same brand, different city, always a weekend. He sent me a document with everything organized by date. I forwarded it to Rebecca that afternoon. Then I pulled up the shared iPad on my kitchen counter. We'd set it up on a family plan 2 years earlier, both accounts still logged in. Neither of us had ever bothered to change that. I went into Claire's location history. I hadn't looked at it before. Some part of me had decided not to. The same part that had closed the browser tab twice and texted Derek, "Yeah, conference, already knew." The location history for the last 2 days of the girls' trip showed her in a different area than the lake house. Not dramatically different on a map, maybe 40 minutes away, but consistently different. Not a day trip. An overnight discrepancy. I took screenshots of the location data and sent them to my own email. Then I closed the iPad and put it back on the counter and went to work. I want to be clear about something. I didn't confront her with any of this. Part of that was Rebecca's advice. Don't tip your hand before the process starts. But part of it was something else, something I'm less proud of. I still didn't entirely want to know. There's a particular kind of suspension you can maintain if you just don't say the words out loud. I'd been living in that suspension for months, old habits. It was Claire who ended it, unintentionally. She made a dinner reservation at Olio, the Italian place where we'd had our first date. She sent me a text about it at noon on a Wednesday. I made a reservation for Saturday. I think we need to reconnect. I stared at that text for a long time. Then I typed back, sounds good. Saturday, I wore the same jacket I'd worn on our actual first date, which was not a sentimental choice. It just fit well, and I hadn't thought about it when I got dressed. We sat at the table and she ordered the same wine she always ordered, and she talked about wanting to refocus on us, about feeling like we'd been ships passing, about how she took some responsibility for the distance. I listened. She was performing sincerity. Not entirely, I don't think. I believe she felt some version of what she was saying. But it was also a managed presentation, and I knew the difference because I'd been paying close attention for 3 weeks. I asked her one question. What do you think has been making you feel disconnected? She answered without hesitating. My intensity, my need for a plan, my tendency to withdraw when things got complicated. She said she thought I'd been emotionally unavailable for most of the past year. She said it gently, like she was doing me a favor by naming it. I said, I hear you. I meant, the papers are already drafted. 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning, I told her. I waited until after breakfast because I didn't want to have the conversation with both of us hungry, which, in retrospect, is a strange thing to have been considerate about. I said, I've filed for divorce. The paperwork was submitted last week. You'll receive formal notification, but I wanted to tell you directly. She said, What? I showed her the file number on my phone. She said, You're not serious. I picked up my keys. I'm going to work. You should contact an attorney. She said, Because of a ring? You're doing this because of a ring? I said, No. And I left. Between 8 in the morning and noon, she called 17 times. I answered the 5th call because I'm not made of stone, and because some part of me, the part that had been married to her for 4 years, still responded to her name on my screen. She went through several phases in the space of about 8 minutes. Disbelief, then something that sounded like negotiation, then anger, then accusation. The accusation was that I had planned this before the trip, that I'd been looking for a reason, that this was about control. Then she cried. Then she was angry again. I said very little. I said, Claire, this is already in process. Please find an attorney. She hung up. She called Joelle. Joelle later told me she kept the call under 2 minutes and said only that I was handling the matter with legal representation. That evening, Claire posted something on social media. I don't follow her account, but a mutual acquaintance screenshotted it and sent it to me with a string of question marks. The post didn't name me. It talked about trusting someone completely and discovering they were never truly present, about how grief looked different than people expected, about choosing yourself. Her friend group responded within minutes. Fire emojis, heart emojis, long comments about strength and growth. Simone commented, You were always carrying this alone. We see you. I screenshotted it and emailed it to Rebecca. Rebecca noted it for the record and said it wasn't unusual. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 mutual acquaintances reached out to me. 2 were awkward and didn't know what to say, so they said very little. The 3rd sent a long message that was clearly informed by Claire's version of events. It used the phrase emotionally unavailable twice, which was a tell. I read it and didn't respond. A colleague at work asked if I was going through something. I said yes, something personal I was managing. He nodded and left it there. The story Claire was building was coherent. If you didn't know the details, he was always closed off. She tried. They grew apart. It was mutual. It was the version that required me to have been continuously absent in a way that explained everything without examining anything. Then discovery started. Rebecca's office formally requested joint account statements going back 14 months. Diane, Claire's attorney, a woman named Diane Ozymensa, who was competent and not unfriendly, submitted an initial response that characterized the discretionary spending as ordinary personal expenses consistent with Claire's normal patterns. Rebecca requested itemization. 3 of the charges, when broken down by merchant and cross-referenced with location data and dates, corresponded directly to the hotel chain from the pre-trip charge. Same brand, same general footprint, the city, the dates, the amount, now formally inside the discovery record. I sat in Rebecca's office while she walked me through it. I kept my hands flat on my thighs because I'd noticed I had a habit of pressing my thumbnail into my index finger when I was trying not to react to something. Then Diane Ozymensa filed a counterclaim. The argument was that I had acted in bad faith by redirecting my direct deposit prior to filing, and further, that my emotional withdrawal from the marriage over the preceding year constituted constructive abandonment, predating Claire's behavior, justifying a revised approach to asset division. The counterclaim cited the relocation we'd made 2 years earlier, when I left a job I liked and we moved for her career opportunity, as evidence of disruption to her professional trajectory that I had subsequently failed to support emotionally. I read the counterclaim in Rebecca's office. Rebecca said it was largely a pressure tactic. The direct deposit redirection was documented and modest. I had not drained anything. And the constructive abandonment argument required evidence she was unlikely to produce convincingly. But it would cost time and legal fees to answer, and it was designed to put me on the defensive. I sat with it. The relocation, I had arranged the move, I had found the movers, transferred the utilities, taken a severance from my previous employer, found a comparable position within 6 weeks. I had covered our rent for the 4 months it took me to find that position, because Claire's salary alone didn't fully stretch. I had absorbed the cost of that transition, financially and otherwise, and never framed it as a sacrifice because it hadn't felt like one at the time. But I had kept every receipt, every invoice, the moving company, the utility transfers, the apartment deposit, the severance documentation. I kept them in a blue folder labeled Relocation 2022 Keep, because I'm methodical about expenses and because at some level I always understood that things you've paid for should be documented. That folder was at Joelle's. I'd dropped off a box of files there 2 weeks ago, things I wanted out of the apartment while the process was ongoing. And the blue folder was in it. I texted Joelle, "Can you pull that blue folder from the box I brought over?" She texted back 30 seconds later. A photo of the folder, the label clearly visible in the light above her kitchen table. Rebecca reviewed the folder's contents on a Monday morning, while I sat across from her with a coffee I kept forgetting to drink. Moving company invoices, utility transfer receipts, the apartment deposit confirmation, my severance letter, a personal loan agreement for $3,800 I'd taken out to cover the gap, signed, dated, fully repaid by the following November, with bank records attached because of course I had attached the bank records. I had documented the entire transition with the thoroughness of someone who understood, at least financially, that you should be able to prove what you've contributed. Rebecca looked up from the folder. This dismantles the counterclaim. She wasn't being dramatic. She was being accurate. The counterclaim's foundation was that the relocation had disrupted Claire's trajectory in ways I'd failed to compensate for. The folder demonstrated that I had funded the relocation, absorbed the income gap, and returned us to financial stability within 6 months. None of which appeared anywhere in Claire's attorney's filing, because Claire's attorney had apparently taken Claire's account of the relocation at face value. Diane Osei-Mensah withdrew the counterclaim 4 days later. The asset division reverted to the original terms, straightforward split of the joint account balance, which by that point contained about $11,000, and confirmation that the lease was solely in my name. The bad faith argument about the direct deposit redirection was also dropped. The documentation Derek had helped me prepare showed every transfer, every date, every amount. Nothing unusual, nothing missing. Rebecca submitted it in 2 pages, and we didn't hear back about it again. What remained formally was the question of the discretionary spending, the 3 hotel charges now inside the discovery record. Claire's attorney's characterization of them as ordinary personal expenses had not survived the itemization request, and Diane Osei-Mensah had stopped pressing that angle without formally acknowledging why. The mediation session was scheduled for the following Thursday. I want to tell you, I spent the days before mediation doing something productive. I mostly worked. I ran 2 project status meetings, approved a materials order, and drove to a job site in the rain on Wednesday morning, and stood under a temporary awning eating a granola bar and looking at a half-finished foundation, while my site supervisor walked me through a concrete delivery issue. Normal work, the kind of thing that requires attention and has nothing to do with your personal life, which is exactly why I was grateful for it. Joelle called Wednesday evening. She asked if I'd eaten an actual meal. I said I'd had a granola bar and half a sandwich. She said that wasn't a meal. I said I'd make pasta. She said she was coming over and she'd bring food, which was not a question. She brought soup and bread from the place near her apartment, and we sat at my kitchen table and she talked about her week, her job, a neighbor dispute, a movie she'd seen, and I was grateful she didn't ask me to rehearse the next day. At some point she said, "You already knew before you called, Rebecca, didn't you? The hotel charge in March. You already knew." I thought about that for a moment. Yeah, but you needed it to be undeniable. I needed it to be something I couldn't explain away. She nodded and broke off a piece of bread. That was the entire conversation about it. It was the most useful conversation I had that week. The mediation conference room was neutral, in the specific way that rooms designed for conflict are always neutral. Beige walls, a long table, water glasses already poured. A mediator named Gerald, who had the energy of someone who had heard every version of every argument and retained professional goodwill anyway. Claire arrived with Diane Osei-Mensah. I arrived with Rebecca. We sat across from each other for the first time since I'd left for work on that Tuesday morning. Claire looked composed. She'd prepared for this. I could tell by the way she held her folder and the way she didn't look at me when she sat down, which was its own kind of looking. Gerald explained the process. Opening statements, then structured discussion, his role as facilitator rather than decision-maker, the goal of reaching a voluntary agreement. Claire's attorney went first. The statement was measured and carefully worded. It described a marriage in which emotional distance had accumulated over years, in which my withdrawal had preceded and contributed to Claire's sense of isolation, in which the relocation had created professional and social disruption that I had not meaningfully addressed. It described the filing as sudden and retaliatory, a unilateral decision made without giving Claire an opportunity to address the problems she hadn't been aware I'd identified. It positioned her as someone who had been trying, who had made the dinner reservation, who had been willing to recommit. I kept my hands flat on the table and let Rebecca respond. Rebecca presented the financial timeline, 14 months of joint account statements, the discretionary charges organized by date, merchant, and cross-referenced location, the 3 hotel charges from the same brand in the same general region, on weekends when Claire had provided other explanations for her whereabouts, the pre-trip charge from February, the one I'd told Derek was a conference, now formally documented alongside the location data from the iPad, which showed Claire in a different area than the lake house for the final 2 nights of the trip. Gerald asked Diane Osei-Mensah whether her client could account for the hotel charges in the discovery record. There was a pause. Diane Osei-Mensah glanced at Claire. Claire looked at me. Not at Rebecca, not at Gerald, at me. And I understood what was in that look. She was calculating what I knew versus what I could prove, and she was arriving in real time at the answer. She'd assumed my patience in the months before the filing meant I hadn't been paying attention. She'd assumed my composure after the filing meant I was hurt and reactive rather than prepared. She'd assumed that the man who straightened the salt shaker twice at dinner and said okay about the ring and made pasta from habit was someone who could be managed back into the previous arrangement. She hadn't assumed the blue folder. She hadn't assumed Derek's spreadsheet. She hadn't assumed that I'd been on the shared iPad. The look lasted about 3 seconds. Then she turned to her attorney and said quietly, "Can we take 5 minutes?" They stepped out. Rebecca and I sat in the conference room. Gerald poured himself more water. I looked at the wall. Rebecca didn't say anything, which I appreciated. When they came back, Diane Osei-Mensah said that her client was prepared to proceed on the original asset division terms and would not be pursuing the contested claims further. The counterclaim was already withdrawn. What she was confirming now was that Claire would not be contesting the grounds. Gerald noted it for the record. Rebecca confirmed acceptance. The session lasted another 40 minutes, covering the division of the joint account, the lease, a joint credit card, a shared streaming account. The ordinary small inventory of a shared life being sorted into 2 piles. I answered questions when Rebecca indicated I should. I initialed documents. I drank some of the water. In the corridor afterward, Claire came out of the conference room while I was still gathering my jacket. Her attorney had gone ahead. She stopped about 6 feet away and said, "I hope you're happy." Her voice was controlled, not cruel, just the voice of someone who needed the last word to have been theirs. I said, "I'm going to be." She walked toward the elevator. That was the last direct conversation we had. The divorce was finalized 9 weeks after filing, clean. Rebecca said it was one of the more straightforward processes she'd run in a while, given the initial counterclaim. I signed the finalization documents on a Wednesday afternoon in her office, and she shook my hand, and I drove to Joelle's because she'd asked me to come for dinner. I went to see a therapist named Dr. Osei, different from Diane Osei Mensa, who I tried not to think about, twice in the weeks following finalization. Not because I was in crisis, because I had a specific question I wanted help thinking through. Why had I spent the better part of a year cataloging signs of a collapsing marriage and calling it patience? Dr. Osei didn't give me a clean answer, which I think was the correct response. He gave me a framework and some questions to sit with. It was useful in the way that practical things are useful, not transformative, just clarifying. I applied for a senior project manager position at a larger firm across the city. I'd been watching the listing for 8 months and hadn't applied because the commute would have been inconvenient for Claire's schedule. She'd mentioned once that she liked us to have the same rough hours, and I had apparently absorbed this as a constraint on my career decisions without either of us formally discussing it. I submitted the application on the day the finalization came through. I got a second interview. 3 weeks after finalization, Claire texted me. One message: "I'm sorry it ended like this. I don't think either of us is a bad person." I read it twice. It was an apology in the shape of an apology. It had the right punctuation and the right sentiment, but it didn't name anything. It split the responsibility evenly across something she had caused. I recognized the architecture of it. I had heard variations of it in that mediation room, in the dinner reservation speech, in every conversation we'd had in the last year, where she'd described the distance between us as something that had simply grown, the way weather changes, without cause or direction. I typed, "Take care of yourself." I sent it and put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and went back to what I'd been doing, which was reviewing a materials estimate for a project at the new firm. I'd gotten the job. I didn't block her. I just had nothing left to say. About a month later, I was at the apartment on a Sunday evening, later than usual getting home, because I'd stopped at the grocery store. I dropped my keys in the ceramic dish by the door, the small blue-gray one from the craft market, and I noticed the ring was still there. It had been there since the morning after I filed, when Claire had come to the kitchen wearing it and then left it on the counter that evening, and hadn't taken it when she moved her things out. I'd put it in the dish because I needed somewhere to put it and hadn't decided what to do with it. I picked it up, I turned it over. The tan line on my own finger had been gone for weeks. I stood there in my jacket with my groceries still in my hand, and I looked at the ring for a moment, and then I set the groceries down and found an envelope in the kitchen drawer. I addressed it to Patrice. Not to Claire, I didn't know her current address and didn't want to, but to Patrice, who I'd always gotten along with, who had noticed things and not always said so, and who I thought would understand why I wasn't keeping it and why I wasn't throwing it away. I sealed the envelope and put it in my jacket pocket to mail in the morning. I put my keys in the dish. It was empty now. I put the groceries away, found what I needed, and started making dinner. I didn't think about whether Claire would understand why I'd sent it to her mother. I'd stopped trying to manage what Claire understood.